Introduce our panelists just as we go so that they don't have to do that again themselves to remind you. Yeah, I'll just say a few words in introduction. A current U.S. government official in the intelligence community remarked to me fairly recently that the foreign policy of the Gulf states until very recently, if you chose to go into that as a specialization or some kind of focus as a diplomat or an intelligence officer, that was a surefire way to make sure that your work product was not widely read. Unless, of course, you were writing about Iran, and then it was a different story. But what that person meant was that for the longest time, the foreign policy of the Gulf states was regarded as stable, very consistent, and very predictable. And now, I think in the last 10 years, none of that is true anymore. The foreign policy of Saudi Arabia has become overt, and it has become interventionist. We've seen this from the decision to use military force in Bahrain in 2011 to the intervention in Yemen that has contributed to a downward spiral of a humanitarian crisis, from a decision that very much caught the U.S. intelligence community off guard to suddenly cut off relations with Qatar and begin a diplomatic embargo. And we can name many other examples. The decision to hold the Prime Minister of Lebanon incommunicado, the decision to make an example out of Canada for routine human rights criticism. And most recently, someone who's very much in our thoughts is Jamal Khashoggi, who has not been heard from, I think, for a week today, since he disappeared in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. So all of that just goes to show that Saudi foreign policy has become interventionist, and I think we can add the descriptor very unpredictable. Bruce Riedel, who's a longtime CIA veteran and Saudi Arabia expert, said last year in a lecture that, in his opinion, Saudiology was perhaps as difficult as Kremlinology was at the height of the Cold War. And I think what he meant by that is just that the inner circle of people who are driving decision-making in Saudi Arabia is so narrow, and at the center of it is a crown prince who is so unpredictable that it makes understanding what is going on in Saudi Arabia and with Saudi foreign policy very, very difficult. And that's as true for intelligence communities around the world as it is for journalists, human rights observers, media, and any other kind of observer. So helping us make sense of the situation are four excellent panelists. I'm going to introduce them as they go, and we're going to get into Saudi foreign policy from all the different angles which it's relevant. Humanitarian, human rights-based, and also just trying to understand what the interest is and whether or not that needs to be reevaluated. So I'm going to start with Roula Jibril, who I don't think needs an introduction. She spoke this morning, professor and author who I think is known to all of you. And I want to give her as much time as possible because she actually has to leave at 1:30. So, yeah.
Thank you again. I would love again to thank Rod Dickinson for organizing this. This is so important and so timely. As the world is discussing Jamal, the Europeans are discussing how to ban selling weapons to the Saudis. I would start actually, as an author, usually you go back and forth. In this case, it's important to go a little bit back to understand where we are heading. And I go back to when Mohammed bin Salman was appointed as a defense minister. And by the way, I want also to thank who the Saudi embassy sent this morning to listen to us. I hope you will take what you are hearing back to the Saudis and tell them the truth, because we will inform our public opinion here, and worldwide will continue on our work. But you need to tell your rulers what the West really think of them. And the wind is shifting, whether they want it or not. So thank you for being here with us. Let me go back to my remarks. If you want to understand, 2 years ago, he was appointed as a defense minister, Mohammed bin Salman. His signature policy was the war on Yemen. And immediately he asserted himself, thinking, I will get rid of the Houthis because this is a way to confront Iran directly. He confronted Iran before in Syria, in Iraq, elsewhere, by financing extremists and basically paving the way for what they called a Sunni revival. So we had a Shia revival after the Iraqi war, where the Shia felt emboldened, and they started, whether in Iraq and elsewhere, to make reference to Iran. Saudi Arabia intervened, but what really made them panic more than anything else was 2011, the Arab Spring. They went berserk, and immediately they start looking at Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And if you want to understand Mohammed bin Salman, you have to talk about, if you want to understand MBS, you have to talk about MBZ, the ruler of, the de facto ruler, who is a military man, who is a very interventionist, who's very muscular. He really actually is the mastermind and the shadow man behind Mohammed bin Salman. He's the one that introduced him to PR. He introduced him to the idea that he needs to use an iron fist, whether it's domestically or internationally. And he needs to intervene because they both felt that they were threatened. Their rule is threatened. The monarchy is threatened by what? Millions of people demanding accountability, transparency, government, and a voice in their own lives and futures. And this is where you can see they set off the counter-revolutionary. The counter-revolutionary, who are both Mohammed bin Salman and both MBZ and MBS, decided to sponsor everything that would stand in the ways of the Arab Spring. So they decided to sponsor activists in Cairo who would storm the US embassy to embarrass basically the Americans who were wavering on what side to take. And they went, from that moment on, 2011 on, they start financing actively, buying more and more weapons, exercising their muscles. So the one thing that was 2011, another episode that really, that you can see a shift, was the Iran deal. The Iran nuclear deal made them not only panic, basically lose their minds. When President Obama decided that he needs, so you have to look at it this way. Basically, it was not 9/11, which is really incredible, and not even the Iraq war. It was the Arab Spring, I would say, number one, as a trigger point. Number two, the Iran nuclear deal. You look at their expenses in terms of budget, defense, and then intervention on financement. The Saudis always finance extremists, and their main export was Wahhabism, but they did it after 9/11 in a different way. What they did after the Iran agreement was basically to finance anybody that would stand in the face of Iran directly or indirectly. So Tamarrud, a movement, whether it's in Egypt, in Tunisia, and then they got these advisors. So Mohammed bin Salman advisors today, if you look at the Mohammed bin Zayed advisor, he had 1 or 2, 3 advisors. One of the main advisors was a guy called Mohammed Dahlan, who led a coup in Gaza. What was he famous for, Mohammed Dahlan? Torturing people, kidnapping them, chopping them off. This is what Mohammed Dahlan is famous for. He tried to do it against Hamas in Gaza. Then he ran off at a certain point because he was under threat and the Palestinian Authority wouldn't give him some kind of immunity. Who was he embraced by? Mohammed bin Zayed. So Mohammed bin Salman come to the scene. The Emiratis think they have an opportunity to shape Saudi policy. That, by the way, in cables, in US cables that were released, the ambassador here of the Emirati ambassador, Otaiba, would call the Saudis cuckoo, crazy. We don't understand these people. Now he is emailing actively journalists to say, this guy is our guy. Exactly what Trump said. This is our man. We helped our man take the reign of Saudi Arabia. So Mohammed bin Salman starts taking paving the way for what we see today as ruthlessness, as recklessness with Yemen. Yemen was the moment where he put an absolute strong flag, where he decided, okay, I'll show the world how I deal with things. And he started bombing this campaign. We saw children being killed in school buses, hospitals, an emergency that I think my colleagues, fellow colleagues here on the panel will speak about in details. But then we see this man asserting himself. Then the world, exactly, he paved or sold this war saying, well, we're fighting Iran. So the Americans start indirectly and directly helping him, not only with weapons, but also with information and data. So America is fighting the war in Yemen, whether they're calling it as such or not. Then basically he takes over and take the country. And that's a moment where he decides that now he needs not only to show the world, but show his citizens how he is a real strong man. His reference point is very clear, is MBZ, who's doing what he's doing covertly and overtly. But now this man is taking it to a new level that not even MBZ can control anymore, or the Americans can control anymore. And we saw that with what he did with Hariri. One of my friends is Paula Yacoubian, who's a parliamentarian now. She's a journalist, and she interviewed Hariri when he was in Saudi Arabia. So when the campaign started to liberate Hariri, they panicked because the world was asking where Hariri is. Was he? And the Lebanese were very smart. They played it strategically. So when the president of Lebanon rejected the resignation, the Saudis were somehow looking at a way out. The French and President Macron offered them a way out. Then they decided, okay, we have to pave the way through what? Media campaign. So they asked this journalist to come in. They flew her in from Beirut. She went in. Yesterday, she declared to The Guardian that she saw Hariri under duress, that he was absolutely under arrest, that he was probably beaten up, and he was forced to resign. So this is how Mohammed bin Salman thinks. Hariri and his father are Saudi subjects. Not Prime Minister of Lebanon, not former Prime Minister, but they are clients because he pays them off. So they need to obey him. And the fact that he's kidnapping a prime minister and forcing him to resign so he can trigger another trigger point and confront Iran in Lebanon, not only in Yemen or in Syria, where he's failing, or in Yemen he's failing. Now he's doing this. When that operation failed, exactly like Trump, he didn't declare defeat. He actually declared victory. And his advisor went on air and said, well, you know, Hariri did this and did that, but it was Hariri. Then they wrapped it up. But then something else happened. It was the most important story in journalism that broke, I believe, a couple of months ago. They knew the story would break. And the story was their alliance with Al-Qaeda once again in Yemen. According to the FBI, there's 60,000 Al-Qaeda fighters who are being paid as we speak by the Saudi Crown Prince and the Emiratis to fight alongside the Saudis and the Emiratis against the Houthi in Yemen. This Association Press story is one of the biggest stories. And you can see Mohammed bin Salman's way of operating the arena. If he cannot crush something, he will try to embrace it. Then he let Hariri release a picture of themselves, you know, hugging each other in Paris. In the meantime, he was making a deal with Al-Qaeda. This kind of erratic, I would say unhinged behavior must tell us something and give us a picture about who this man is. He's a danger to his people. He's a danger to the stability and I would say economic interest and geopolitical interest of the West. What he did to Canada shows you that he can do not only to Qatar and dump nuclear waste on their border, which he wants to do, which is a thuggish behavior. But what he did to Canada was the warning to every Western country, well, put up or shut up, or we will not buy your weapons, sell you oils, but we will, if you dare, this is the message, if you dare criticizing us, we will come after you by any means. What he did to Canada was a moment where he was telling the West, it's a message to the West, not even to his people, message to every Western government, ladies and gentlemen, there's a new thug in town, there's a new mad Gaddafi, and this is the way I will deal with you. I hope the world is listening and carefully, and it's time to put a pressure campaign on this individual. Otherwise, I predict that there will be many Jamals kidnapped. I believe many government, Western government, will be under pressure the same way. And it's time really to not only strategize how to deal with these individuals, but how to deal with the Saudi ruling family and send them a clear message. If you don't deal with him, the rest of the world will. Because, and I want to bring this example. One of the Jamal columns, he compared him to Putin. He's more dangerous than Putin. Putin is strategic. Putin, whatever he does, there's a rationale, his own rationale to it. This man, but Putin also killed a journalist 12 years ago. Her name is Anna Politkovskaya. The world ignored the crime. 12 years on, he sent his people in the UK to use chemical weapons on UK soil. Mohammed bin Salman will go even worse than this if he's not stopped. I'm here to ask the world to actually hold this man to account for the crimes he's committing in Yemen against his own people, and probably he committed against Jamal on foreign soil. And what we are doing is preventive action, because if he's not stopped, he will continue to commit these crimes elsewhere. Thank you.
I want to turn things over to Andrea Prasau of Human Rights Watch, Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch in Washington, and I believe to talk about the human rights record in the war in Yemen.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here. And it's the second time today I've heard someone compare MBS to Gaddafi. I think we're going to be hearing more of that lately. And things did not turn out well for Gaddafi. Or for the Libyans, so hopefully things don't go down that road. Alex, you started off by talking about foreign policy, and we're here to talk about Saudi foreign policy. And Putin actually is what I think of when I think about MBS. And the strategic issues aside, what Putin has done very successfully is that he's used external action to detract from the domestic human rights crackdown. And in many ways, I think that's what the war in Yemen is. Now, obviously, for those of us who follow it, we know that it wasn't intended to be this prolonged war. MBS thought he could go in, take a few weeks, fix things. That didn't work out. But now, because in part because the war is popular in Saudi Arabia, I think the war in Yemen provides a bit of a shield for the domestic human rights issues, which we talked about this morning and are highly relevant. Unfortunately, of course, the war in Yemen, aside from being tremendously tragic in a humanitarian sense, is also really rife with human rights abuses and violations of the laws of war. So that's what I want to talk about now and do a bit of a summary of that, including Human Rights Watch's own documentation. So I'll give you just a few numbers. I'll try not to overwhelm you with numbers because the numbers themselves actually are overwhelming. But when it comes to civilian casualties, as of August of this year, the UN Human Rights Office had documented the killing of over 6,500 civilians and wounding of over 10,000. in Yemen, and airstrikes by the Saudi-led coalition were the primary cause of those civilian casualties. And of course, the numbers on the millions who are suffering famine, near famine, food shortages, cholera, other health crises is really egregious. Human Rights Watch ourselves, we've documented 87 apparently unlawful attacks, which have killed nearly 1,000 civilians, including 241 children. The vast majority of those attacks are airstrikes, and coalition airstrikes have killed hundreds of civilians and also targeted civilian areas, so homes, hospitals, markets, medical facilities, and so on. This is even after, for example, there was a period in 2017 when the coalition promised to revise, that it had revised its rules of engagement and tightened them. In a 2-month period last summer after the coalition made that promise, we documented an additional 6 strikes, which killed 55 civilians, including 33 children. So in the course of this war, despite coalition promises, we have not seen really any change in the targeting practices by the coalition. Now, I keep saying coalition for a reason, and I'll get to that in a little more detail soon, but the coalition is led by Saudi Arabia. The airstrikes are conducted largely by Saudi Arabia, but not exclusively. And the coalition does not identify which country is responsible for which strike, whether it's an airstrike or a ground engagement. Ground engagements are usually easier to track because you just look at the people and what uniform they're wearing and so on. Although, of course, the UAE in particular uses proxies. So when it comes to, for example, the abusive detention that we and journalists have documented, it's by UAE forces themselves or their proxies. Yemenis that they have trained, who work under them or for them. So the coalition hands are on all of these abuses, but it's not always easy to identify which coalition member is responsible for them. When it comes to the use of unlawful weapons, we've also documented that by all parties to the coalition. So the Houthis have used banned landmines. The coalition has used cluster munitions, which unfortunately are not banned everywhere, not by the US, which sells them. And we've documented cases where Saudi Arabia agreed not to use, for example, UK-produced cluster munitions and then just used Brazilian-produced cluster munitions. So any response to international pressure is usually a matter of PR. So sort of immediate response, oh, we take those concerns seriously, we'll change, but then it's really business as usual, time and time again. I already mentioned detention, so I want to talk a little bit about accountability, primarily, or lack thereof. So I talked about the abuse of airstrikes, which, when I say unlawful, we believe they violate the laws of war. The coalition, again, the coalition, set up a mechanism to investigate abuses. The mechanism, it's called the JIAT, is meant to investigate really any allegations of abuse, but has primarily investigated airstrikes. Now, the reality is that most investigations have been about airstrikes because it's easier to investigate airstrikes. They come from the sky, people watch them happen. The international attention is on those airstrikes. And even for researchers like Human Rights Watch, it's much easier for us to investigate airstrikes than Houthi abuses at times, in large part because the Saudis have blocked our access to the Houthi-controlled areas. So the common criticism I get from the Saudi embassy is, why are you not documenting enough Houthi abuses? We do. We just put out a report last week, and others, but we would do even more if we could get into the Saudi-controlled areas. But the Saudis have banned human rights researchers and journalists from flights into Sana'a and elsewhere. So the JIAT was set up to investigate allegations of violations of human rights, or targeting, whatever the case may be. And the JIAT was created essentially by the US. The State Department sent someone over to Saudi Arabia to work with them to develop this mechanism. The concept of having a mechanism that investigates violations is one that I fully support. It's a good one. But in its implementation, the JIAT has been an utter disaster. It's effectively whitewashed all abuses by the Saudi-led coalition. It doesn't have any sort of robust public reporting or transparency, although we produced a lengthy and detailed report on the failures of the JIAT about a month or 6 weeks ago. Following the release of that report, they've produced more reports of their own investigations. So we studied all of the publicly available reports of JIAT investigations and discussed their failings. One of the failings is that they were not making many of them public, so they have released sort of additional tranches of investigations, which is important. It's an important step towards increased transparency. But in almost all cases, the JIAT absolves the coalition of any responsibility. It again, does not identify which member of the coalition was responsible for the incident being investigated. So you don't know if it's an airstrike, if it was a Saudi pilot, an Emirati pilot, or any other member of the coalition. It rarely finds wrongdoing. Sometimes it finds a so-called technical mistake. And even in the few cases where it has found wrongdoing, we've documented only a handful of cases of redress or compensation, depending on the circumstances. It depends sort of what you would call some kind of monetary payment to the families of victims or survivors of strikes. So we've seen almost no compensation. That's a gross failing of the coalition's obligation for sure. And what we also haven't seen, which is I think of greatest concern, is that if you don't find the reason that a strike killed civilians, if you don't acknowledge that there was something wrong with civilians being killed, then you can't change your targeting practice the next time. So for example, a common practice of militaries is to blanket a civilian area with pamphlets to say, we're moving in, this happens in Afghanistan all the time, we're moving into this village tomorrow. All civilians should gather their belongings and get out. If you do that and conduct a military action and still kill a lot of civilians, the lesson is that didn't work. That was a bad measure. It didn't protect civilians. We need to do something different next time. But if you never acknowledge that civilians were harmed, or that if they were harmed, there was something wrong with that, then you can't take into account those lessons when it comes to future targeting decisions. And I think that's why we've seen essentially no change in targeting. This is despite the US government's alleged pressure on Saudi Arabia to adjust its practices. I say alleged because even though I actually truly believe that the US consistently presses the Saudis and other coalition partners on their conduct, it hasn't taken any steps to make them feel like they have to actually change. And we saw that when Secretary Pompeo certified a few weeks ago that the coalition was doing essentially what it needs to do when it comes to protecting civilians. So we haven't seen anything robust from the US at all. And in part, I think this is because the US is actually a party to this conflict as well and risks legal liability because it's complicit in a lot of these activities. The US denies its role, although it articulates facts which clearly satisfy the legal standard. In fact, what was most interesting to me, Human Rights Watch first said the US was a party to the coalition in, I think, November 2015, pretty early on. And government officials were outraged and everyone said it wasn't true. And my favorite response is this spring in response to the discussion on the War Powers Resolution in Congress, whether the US was legally authorized to be involved in this conflict. The acting general counsel of the Defense Department wrote a detailed letter to the Senate explaining how the US is not involved, with a nice description of all the ways the US is involved that clearly meet the legal standard for being a party to this conflict. So they have a disagreement on the law with us and with others, so be it, but the facts are pretty clear. Refueling of aircraft, providing intelligence information, providing targeting information, and all of this is connected to the fact that the US continues to sell weapons to the Saudis, to the Emiratis, and others. Now, as some of you may know, there is an informal hold on the latest sale of weapons to Saudi Arabia. As I understand it, that informal hold is pretty firm. And I think that one of the outcomes of what's happened with Jamal Khashoggi is that members of Congress in particular are very concerned about whether they can rely on MBS. As you all know, MBS came here, met with members of Congress, traveled around the country, really put on a lovely show about what a reformer he was. And the administration's position doesn't seem to have changed. We've seen a few statements from the Vice President, the President, Secretary Pompeo, which is better than nothing, but nothing strong. But we've seen really strong statements from members of Congress who I think feel that they are owed something more from MBS than what they've gotten so far. So first of all, I hope Jamal appears on the streets of Istanbul alive and well any moment. But I do think that a consequence of this action is that members of Congress are starting to see the truth behind the sort of fancy show that MBS put on. Time will tell whether that really holds, but I think that's an important thing to watch for in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Andrea. I believe it's also true that the coalition has never released a list of the jurists who are on the Jayat. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I think that's right.
But anyway, I want to come back to the theme of how these issues are playing out in Congress. But first I want to introduce Kate Kaiser, who is the policy director at a DC-based group called Win Without War. It's a progressive advocacy group that's very much at the center of the fights on Capitol Hill and elsewhere about Yemen and this administration's Iran policy. So Kate, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Alex. So it's a great segue as I'm going to talk about U.S. responses to Saudi Arabia's foreign policy. And I'll talk first about the administration's response to MBS and then talk a little bit about Congress, what Andrea was mentioning at the end of her remarks. So I think the general trend that we've seen under the Trump administration is really an outsourcing of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East to Saudi Arabia as well as the UAE. There is a flattering of MBS under Trump. You know, the U.S. has always been pro-Saudi. It's always been seen as kind of the pillar of stability for U.S. policy in the region, but it is at a really new level under this administration. And I think there's, you know, various things that go into that. One of them is that this president really focuses on foreign policy as a transactional matter. He really deals with things as what is in it for him, can he make the best deal, what is his return on investment, and I think that's one of the reasons that he highlights arms sales as one of kind of the best indicators of the health of a relationship with a foreign country. When MBS was here, I believe most recently, he had him in the White House in the Oval Office with a big picture of all of the different arms sales and different U.S. jobs that were being created, even though when you actually dig into the numbers, there's not actually a lot of jobs tied to these sales. And Saudi Arabia is also increasingly getting more and more co-production deals with U.S. defense contractors, which means actually that these weapons are being produced in the country. So the jobs, if any, are being created are actually Saudi Arabian jobs, which, you know, good for that economy, but it kind of undermines the president's argument of why they are such a good ally. Another aspect of this is there's obviously been a lot of questions raised about foreign influence in the White House, and most of that has focused on Russia. But there is certainly a very large Gulf influence element to all of this, which is also tied in with the president's as well as his son-in-law, Jared Kushner's own business interests in the Gulf itself. And how, again, there's this quid pro quo of what are you doing for me, what are they doing for us, that comes back to this return on investment. And that's why one reason it was reported that Secretary Pompeo decided to certify that Saudi and the UAE and the coalition were doing everything that they could to minimize civilian harm in Yemen because they wanted to protect weapon sales to these countries. So this is just how another aspect of this transactional foreign policy is really overtaking any other consideration of U.S. interest, because in that situation, you had all of the expert bureaus at the State Department telling the secretary that actually you should not be certifying this, just use a national security waiver because we cannot justify this argument. And then you allegedly had the head of legislative affairs at the State Department, who is also a former Raytheon lobbyist, saying, oh, if you don't certify this, it will hurt any future arms sales, like this large $2 billion pending sale that Senator Menendez currently has a hold on. And so we see this kind of outsourcing of U.S. policy happening in a region in a variety of ways. You saw it obviously with Yemen, where, oh dear, the U.S. has largely, unquestionably continued its support, and under Trump also increased its military support to the coalition by putting U.S. personnel back in the Joint Planning Cell. That helps with airstrikes, increasing intelligence sharing, obviously increasing the amount of weapons. You also see this in the ignorance of the administration or denial of not only the U.S. role in the Saudi-led intervention in Yemen, but also about the allegations of mass torture and arbitrary detention in the south of Yemen by UAE or UAE proxy forces, where the Pentagon has said, oh, there's no U.S. military involvement, that's not really happening, the AP journalist, HRW reporting is not actually accurate. And so I think, you know, what we're seeing is there is essentially, by deciding to not have any accountability in their policy or any questioning of whether these actions actually serve U.S. interests, which I think Andrew will talk a little bit about, what you see is essentially a blank check for impunity in Yemen in particular, but also throughout the region. And one final way that I think, you know, there's also kind of the strengthening of the alliance is about finding a way to, quote unquote, confront Iran in the region. They're under MBS and MBZ. There is now a new alliance with Israel, and these three countries are actively seeking ways to, quote unquote, confront Iran or mount a US-led conflict with Iran in the region, whether that's in Iraq, it's in Syria, it's in Yemen. When you talk about these different conflicts, this administration really talks about them all as a proxy war with Iran, that any U.S. involvement in these conflicts or countries is really about getting rid of nefarious Iranian influence, even where it doesn't largely exist, as in the case of Yemen, where Iran has only really gotten involved as a result of the Saudi-led intervention that gave them an excuse to get involved and, essentially achieve their goals of meddling in Saudi Arabia's interests and causing an overreaction. And now the Saudis, along with their coalition members, are largely overextended in a quagmire that they can't get out of. Now, while we've seen this kind of outsourcing for more conflict, more intervention in the region without U.S. questioning by this administration, we've seen a growing opposition in Congress. And I think this is really a result of, mass atrocities being mounted with U.S. support in Yemen. I think it's also a lack of a clear, coherent strategy by this administration. Where is the end game? If we're blindly following MBS and MBZ, where is that going? How is it actually meeting U.S. interests? And I think a key example of this that is not very much talked about is the kind of de facto alliances that we've seen in these various conflict theaters with Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups. You have widespread investigation by the Associated Press in Yemen that there are actively being deals made with Al-Qaeda fighters and recruiting them into the fight against the Houthis by the UAE in particular. And while the Pentagon officially denied this report, unnamed U.S. officials later confirmed that this was actually the case. So it's like this open secret, but no one really wants to talk about it. And I think that's raised a lot of eyebrows in Congress because theoretically, the U.S. traditionally has largely viewed the Middle East through a security lens, particularly since 9/11. And so suddenly we're in these alliances where, particularly in Yemen, you have them fighting Houthi forces, but then they're fighting on the side of Al-Qaeda militants who have been recruited into that. And so then somehow the U.S. is like the de facto air force for Al-Qaeda in this war. And I think, there's a lot of questions to be raised, and there needs to be a light shown on that to expose how this outsourcing of U.S. policy is really detrimental, not only to our perceived national security interests, but also to the people of the country, because they are prolonging these conflicts, increasing the bloodshed, and preventing any type of accountability, like Andrew was saying. And so as a result of that, we've seen attempts to block arms sales in Congress. In August 2016, under the Obama administration, there was the first attempt. It only garnered 27 senators of support to block a tank sale. Then in June 2017, when Trump removed, there was a de facto hold under the Obama administration on weapon sales to the Saudis due to atrocities in Yemen that was input in December 2016. Trump came into the office, he removed that. And released the sale of precision-guided munitions or smart bombs. The Senate, again, tried to block the sale. Just within that short period of time, you had an increase of 20 senators joining to block the sale at 47, right on the cusp of being able to say, no, the sale should not go forward, and send the political message that Rula was talking about that needs to be sent to say that this policy is not okay. And then over the last year, we've also seen invocation of Congress's war powers. Now, as most people in this room are likely aware, Congress authorized a counterterrorism war in 2001, as well as the invasion of Iraq in 2002. And since that time, no one has really wanted to vote on war and peace issues. And so there's been these authorizations, and slowly but surely our war on terror, as it's called, around the world has expanded to over 76 countries, according to the Cost of Wars Project at Brown University. And to places like Yemen, where it started as the U.S., was intervening to fight Al-Qaeda since 2002, and then supporting the Saudi-led coalition as a means of placating the Gulf due to their acceptance of the Iran deal. But now, because of what's happening in Yemen and how bad it has gotten, and the indication from the administration that they will not do anything different without any pressure from Congress or other actors, you've started seeing Congress trying to vote on its own war powers and reassert itself that way. And I think that's a very significant thing, and that if one chamber of the House or Senate should flip to Democratic control after the midterms, that could be a real challenge to this outsourcing of U.S. policy to the Gulf, because Democratic leadership in particular in the House has signed on to co-sponsor the latest War Powers Resolution to end U.S. involvement in Yemen. And if they get the gavel, I think we're going to see more and more of that.
Thank you, Kate. And last, I want to introduce Andrew Miller, who is the Deputy Director for Policy at the Project on Middle East Democracy. And formerly, I hope I get this right, was the Director of Military Issues for Egypt and Israel and the
Close.
National.
I was director for Egypt and for Israel military.
I got it backwards.
Yeah.
For the National Security Council under the previous administration, and a longtime State Department expert on the Middle East. And I think it's just helpful, since we've heard about a lot of the human rights implications of the shift in foreign policy, to take a step back and to understand what are the U.S. interests in this part of the world, whether they be commercial, counterterror, you have it, and to understand the way those interests are being met or being tested.
Thanks, Alex. First, I just want to say that my thoughts and prayers are with the family and friends of Jamal Khashoggi. Like Andrea, I'm hoping against hope that he will turn up in Istanbul unharmed and with his freedom, and that will remain on my mind, I know, and many others for the coming period. As Alex said, I'm going to take a step back and put the U.S.-Saudi relationship in the broader context, both of Saudi foreign policy but also of U.S. foreign policy. The first point I would make is something that Kate mentioned in terms of the transactional nature of the U.S.-Saudi relationship. And the reality is that the U.S.-Saudi relationship has always been transactional. In fact, it may be the quintessential transactional foreign policy relationship. And it essentially began as a simple bargain. In exchange for an external security guarantee from the United States, Saudi Arabia committed to ensuring the free and full supply of its petroleum products of oil to the broader, to the United States and to the broader international community. So it was that oil for security bargain that really was the core of the U.S.-Saudi relationship. But that is a fundamentally transactional one. To the extent there was any type of strategic alignment, it was a general preference for the status quo, which was a negative condition. And negative conditions don't necessarily make for the best strategic relationships. When you think of a strategic relationship, you think of the US and NATO, which was as much about a negative condition keeping the Soviets out as it was about a positive condition, which was integration, which was communication and fostering closer transatlantic ties between the United States and the European countries. But that has always been lacking in the US-Saudi relationship. There isn't the same cultural bedrock underlying the US-Saudi relationship that can help to make a transactional relationship strategic, nor were there a sufficient number of areas of common interest that could make for a more durable geopolitical alignment. So again, at its essence, it has been a transactional relationship, and that hasn't fundamentally changed over the last several decades. The second point that is important to make is that that fundamental bargain, the oil for security, no longer is as compelling or as cohesive as it once was. For the United States, Saudi oil is less important than it used to be, and for Saudi Arabia, the U.S. security guarantee, the external guarantee, is less sufficient than it used to be. So if you're looking at it from the U.S. perspective, historically, Saudi Arabia had the largest proven oil reserves. That's no longer the case. It's Venezuela. But nevertheless, that gave Saudi tremendous influence over the price of oil to keep prices at a reasonable level so there could be global economic growth. Now, due to the multiplicity of suppliers of oil and gas and other types of petroleum products, Saudi no longer has the same influence over the long-term price of oil. What Saudi Arabia still does, which remains valuable, is that it can protect against short-term shocks, short-term abrupt increases in the price of oil and gas. And that's simply because Saudi Arabia is the only country that keeps some degree of oil production in reserve. For any other private company, it's always in their interest to supply as much oil or gas as possible. But because Saudi Arabia is an oil company married to a country, for strategic reasons, they keep some degree of oil and gas in reserve, which means that if there is an unanticipated shock that reduces the supply of oil to the global market, Saudi Arabia can step in, release what they were holding in reserve, and help to stabilize the prices. So in the short term, that's valuable because it prevents a huge spike like we've seen at various points in US history that has had a very negative impact on the economy. But it's not the same as it was before. In the long term, even if Saudi, for instance, were to begin withholding oil because they wanted to punish the United States, because of fracking and other sources of oil, the United States now has the wherewithal to bring into production a number of other replacement sources. And what makes this equation work is that as the price of oil increases, it becomes more marketable, it becomes more financially practical for US frackers, which procure oil at a higher price, to do so. So there's a natural self-correction. The days of the 1970s when Saudi Arabia could bring the entire oil market into a complete paralysis for years at a time no longer obtain. It's really the short-term damage that Saudi Arabia can do, and in that, there is reason to continue working with them, but we have to understand that we get less. It's less important than it used to be. Now, from the Saudi perspective, they still value the external security guarantee, but arguably, the greatest threat to Saudi security now is internal. And there is a question as to whether the external security guarantee the United States has provided does or should extend to protection against internal threats to the Saudi royal family from its own population. Not just from potential extremist organizations, but from legitimate, peaceful protesters and dissenters who want to take the country in a different direction. So for Saudi Arabia, they're no longer content with the protection from the outside. They're no longer content that the US will prevent Russia or Iran or an Iraq under another circumstance from entering their territory. They also want the United States to ensure that the Saud royal family can withstand any internal challenges. So what that means is that previous bargain is no longer strong enough to keep the relationship together. The third point is, in addition to the fraying of this original bargain, new issues have come to the fore. One of them, as I mentioned already, which is Saudi concern with their internal political dynamics. But for the United States, we also have increased concern about Saudi religious proselytization around the world, which I think has been demonstrated to have an influence in fanning extremism and in fanning the very doctrine, the very theology that groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State have used to justify their violent actions across the globe. There's also, for the same reason that Saudi Arabia is concerned with their internal politics, the US needs to be increasingly concerned with the human rights environment. Because if the United States still has an interest in preserving the Saud family's rule over Saudi Arabia, they have to pay more attention to how the Saudi citizens are being treated, not just in economic terms, but do they have the opportunity to express themselves politically, socially, culturally. And to the extent they're not, that could very well increase the pressure on the Saudis and lead to some type of regime change down the road, maybe even sooner than we would think. So again, that bargain is not only beginning to fray, but there are other issues that it doesn't encompass, that it didn't account for, that aren't factored into the bargain. So what this suggests is my fourth point, which is that we're at an inflection point in the US-Saudi relationship. There needs to be a renegotiation of the terms that unite the US and Saudi Arabia. There needs to be a reclarification of what the US is seeking from Saudi Arabia and what Saudi Arabia is seeking from the United States. And from the perspective of the United States, and from my perspective as a former US official, obviously we want those terms to be as beneficial as possible to the US. We want to get a good bargain. Now, these are the exact same circumstances the Trump administration confronted when they assumed office about 2 years ago. And they took it in a certain direction. There were three possible ways to go. If this is fundamentally a business relationship, you could decrease the volume of business, you could sustain the current amount of business, or you could increase the amount of business. What we've seen is that the Trump administration has chosen to increase the amount of business, to increase the U.S. exposure to Saudi Arabia and to that particular bilateral relationship in terms of our overall foreign policy portfolio. And Arula, Andrea, and Kate have all mentioned various aspects of this, but fundamentally the Trump administration wants three things from the Saudis, in addition to the preservation or the continuation of consistent supplies of oil. One, they think that Saudi Arabia should essentially take over for the United States. Saudi Arabia should be the U.S. proxy. They should play a bigger role in battling against the Iranians and battling against extremist groups like the Islamic State, and we are giving them enough weapons over the years. They should be capable of picking up the baton from the United States. Because as we know, President Trump views the Middle East as essentially a wasteland, where the U.S. has expended billions of dollars with very little return. And we certainly can quibble with that in one direction or the other, but I think it's abundantly clear that is how he views the region. And in that particular context, he views Saudi Arabia as the relief pitcher. They're going to come in, take it up for the United States, and do what the United States would have done and reduce the burden on U.S. soldiers, on U.S. diplomats, on the American taxpayer. The second thing that the administration wants, and Kate, you were mentioning this in terms of arms sales, they view Saudi Arabia as an ATM machine. And that essentially that they're going to personally subsidize the arms industry in the United States. In contrast to countries like Israel or Egypt that purchase U.S. equipment with American taxpayer money, Saudi Arabia overwhelmingly uses its own national funds. So that's additional money coming in to the American economy. And that's, in theory, additional jobs, but as Kate said, it actually doesn't provide the number of jobs you would expect. And the other point I would add is that Saudi Arabia is not in the healthiest economic position. These ideas that they're going to be able to fulfill $100 billion in arms sales over the next decade may be tested by the realities of the financial position of Saudi Arabia as oil prices have not recovered enough, as Saudi Arabia's own internal obligations increase with a larger population. And then the third thing that the administration wants of the Saudis is they want them to help deliver the ultimate deal between the Israelis and Palestinians. And while this seems silly, it's also something at a different level the Obama administration hoped. There's a reason that President Obama went to Riyadh before he went to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, before he went to Cairo. He was hoping to enlist then King Abdullah to bless some type of peace process. In the same way, although in a far less transparent way, it appears that President Trump, Jared Kushner, Jason Greenblatt, and others believe the Saudis will pressure the Palestinians to accept a few pennies on the dollar for what they could have gotten under previous administrations. And for a while, it did look like it was going to play out in that way, or at least it looked like the Saudis would fulfill their end of the bargain. MBS was making comments that were seemingly supportive of the peace plan that none of us has seen, but the administration assures us exists. But in recent months, we've seen that King Salman has kind of reined in his son and said, not so fast, Saudi Arabia, we support the Palestinian position. I mean, what is the net effect of this? What is the net effect of this approach? And essentially what we've done is we've increased our exposure, we've doubled down on the Saudis, and we have enabled them to act as they see fit within the region. And I think it can't be described as anything other than an unmitigated disaster. Iran is not any closer to being checked than it was before. We have no progress in the ultimate deal. These putative arms sales do not seem to be in the offing. Even the price of oil, it doesn't appear that the Saudis are exerting their full effort to try to stabilize the current price, and leading President Trump to make remarks such as we saw last week or the other week, where he said the leadership in Saudi Arabia wouldn't last, wouldn't last for a few weeks unless it were for the U.S. security protection. So it's clear that instead of giving Saudi Arabia the space to act on behalf of US interests, to act on behalf of bilateral joint interests. It has enabled the worst instincts of Mohammed bin Salman, the worst instincts of the Saudi royal family. They used to say that the one thing you could count on from the Saudis was caution, that they were a notoriously cumbersome decision-making process where decisions were vetted with the broader royal family. Now they are rash. Now they are erratic, as was said before. And this has led to any number of problems, the most recent of which was obviously the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi. But Alex, you mentioned these at the outset. We've seen the kidnapping of a sitting prime minister of a foreign country. We've seen the disaster in Yemen. We've seen the detention of dozens of princes in what appears to have been a shakedown. So it doesn't look like the net result of the administration's policy of increasing our exposure to Saudi Arabia has led to the desire that we want. So that leads to the fifth point, which is we obviously need a different approach. And obviously it's going to be difficult to convince the Trump administration to do anything differently. They've proven notoriously resistant to external advice. But it's worth beginning to have this conversation now, both in the hope that Congress will take action to rein in the executive branch and to establish boundaries on what they can do, but also to help shape what I hope will be a robust foreign policy discussion in 2020, where issues of concern to the United States in our foreign relations can be debated both within the Democratic primary, potentially within a Republican primary if someone challenges President Trump, but most certainly in the general election. And I am not going to articulate a full program of how we should deal with the Saudis, but I think there are three guiding principles that we need to apply. First, we need to resist the temptation to provide an internal security guarantee for the Saudis. There is still good reason to protect the Saudis from external invasion, not only because of the importance of Saudi Arabia, but more broadly because of the importance of maintaining established borders. But we should not be drawn into a position where we're defending the Saudi regime against its own citizens, particularly those citizens who are protesting, who are engaging in political activity in a way that is peaceful, in a way that is constructive. We should not be defending MBS against women's activists. We should not be defending MBS against human rights activists. We should not be defending him against young people who feel that they haven't been given the same opportunities. So we need to draw a firm distinction between an external security guarantee and internal security guarantee and resist the pressure from the Saudis to begin to blur the lines between those two. The second point, which is important, is we need to begin drawing lines, and we need to begin imposing conditions for how we're going to work together. And this is a direct response to what we have seen, which is by simply giving a blank check to the Saudis, we can't trust their judgment, we can't trust their capabilities. They may still be able to play some type of role in advancing mutual interest, and if we can do that, we should certainly take them up on it, but that's only going to come about if we're far more directive in terms of what we want them to do and how we want them to do it. So in terms of arms sales, if arms sales do start to move forward, we should place conditions on how they're moved. And there is a historical context for this. In past years, when we have sold aircraft, for instance, to Saudi Arabia, we prohibited them from deploying them in their air base in the northwest, which would have been the most likely launching point for an attack against Israel. So this is something that we've seen in analog that can work, and it's also something that they have been willing to accept in the past. We need to explore that. We should also think very carefully about the development of a nuclear industry within Saudi Arabia. This is another area where they're moving into, and if Saudi Arabia wants to develop nuclear power for peaceful purposes, that's one thing, but if they're asking to enrich uranium, if they're asking to produce the fuel domestically, that increases the probability of some type of weapons breakout. And it would be foolhardy to compound the error of withdrawing from the JCPOA by actually helping to bring into existence a nuclear-armed Middle Eastern state in addition to Israel. The consequences for proliferation would be horrendous. They would be catastrophic. So we should definitely refrain from doing that. The third and final point that I think should guide the relationship is we need to elevate the importance of human rights and of the proselytization dialogue within the broader relationship. And this has worked in the past. One of the things that has been forgotten is that back in the 1960s, JFK had a private discussion with then Crown Prince Fahd and said, look, I'm doing this privately. I don't want to embarrass you. You have slavery in your country. You have a complete absence of any type of political and social space. The treatment of women is deplorable. You need to do something about this. And within a matter of months, slavery was abolished. So there is a possibility that US intervention, maybe starting privately, can have an effect. If that private dialogue does not lead to the intended results, then we should certainly consider the degree to which we publicly discuss those issues. And I think in the case of Jamal, we've certainly reached the point where the public expressions of concern are fully justified. And I would like to see more of that from President Trump, from Vice President Pence, and from Secretary of State Pompeo. But if we are looking at the broader trajectory of the region, Saudi Arabia is an important country, if only because of the land it occupies, if only because they have 25 million people. This is not a small country by regional standards. And the Saudis may be right that the greatest threat in the medium to long term is their own population, is the nature of politics within that country. And we have every reason to help the Saudi regime negotiate that process so that there is increasing liberalization, so there's increasing normalization of politics, so we don't have the type of either or scenario where it's either defending what is increasingly a predatory regime against its own people or opening up the floodgates to an uncertain future.
I might leave with one word. There's no way America can have their interests protected, whether it's economic interest or political interest or any interest, if our relationship with this predatory regime is divorced from any values that America itself is promoting for their own citizens. If there's no justice and no stability for Americans, and forget about everybody mentioned. It might be a job for Jared Kushner when he leaves the White House, but it will not be a job for the average Joes in Wisconsin and elsewhere. So I'm sorry, it's time to tell these people things as they are, and I think the only way to speak to Trump is through. Sorry, otherwise he will not listen because the guy seems to listen to his. Alternative realities. Thank you again.
Yeah. Thanks, Rula.
On
our way to a BBC interview. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
Just to close, so we're at this point where we need to renegotiate the bilateral relationship. I laid out some principles that should guide that. Obviously, how it comes out is going to be partially a function of leverage. Who has more to gain, who has more to lose. And I think what's important for a U.S. audience to remember is that ultimately we remain more important to Saudi Arabia than the inverse. And again, the Saudis can play an important role in stabilizing oil prices, but that's a convenience. It's not an existential concern. We should try to minimize disruption to the U.S. economy, to the global economy, but ultimately, we're going to survive that. The world is going to survive that. By contrast, there's no one else, no other country that is prepared to provide an external security guarantee to the Saudis. The Russians aren't going to do this. The Russians can't be trusted to do this, given that they have close relations with the Iranians. No regional actor can play this role. If the Saudis want a guarantee from external invasion, they have only one country to look to, and that's the United States. And that means that we have real leverage. And in closing, I want to share a quote from Clark Clifford, who was Harry Truman's legal counsel and is commonly viewed as the first national security advisor. And if you recall, there was a debate over whether to recognize Israel and the reaction this would have within the Arab world. And obviously there are differences to this day on what should have been done. But what Clark Clifford said about this in 1948, I think, remains true today. And that was Saudi Arabia's, quote, need of the United States is greater than our need for them, end quote. And I think that principle still applies, and in recalibrating, renegotiating the bilateral relationship, we shouldn't lose sight of that fundamental reality.
Thanks, Andrew. So I'm going to get the discussion going by asking a couple of questions. I'm going to address the first question to Andrea, but both of you are also welcome to chime in. So, Andrea, you mentioned the letter that the Department of Defense sent to the Senate, I think this spring. And in that letter, they wrote that any limitation on the assistance package that we provide to the coalition would, quote, further exacerbate the situation and humanitarian crisis. And this is an argument we hear all the time, that U.S. engagement is actually limiting what could be a worse situation, civilian casualty-wise. So I'm wondering, has your organization seen, through human rights monitoring, et cetera, has your organization seen evidence for that claim, and how you respond to that argument?
So I think it's true that on a strike-by-strike basis, U.S. involvement probably reduces civilian harm. What we've heard, assuming it's accurate from Defense Department officials and others, is that when the U.S. was more involved in the control room, and the U.S. would give a list of targets to largely Saudi pilots, those strikes would be carried out appropriately. The U.S. officials would leave the room. The Saudis would engage in their own targeting. And what we hear now is that it's the dynamic targeting where the incidents occur, where something happens and they respond at the time. It's not often a pre-planned target. And that it's those strikes that are causing the civilian casualties. I don't have a reason not to believe that. We have a lot of concerns about the way the U.S. military operates, but in general, they're pretty good at what they do. So I think that it's probably true on a strike-by-strike basis. The question is the continued U.S. involvement in the conflict with what is perceived as unequivocal support, that regardless of what the coalition does, the U.S. will still support it. Is that contributing to the prolonging the conflict, preventing the coalition from taking the steps it needs to take to reduce civilian harm, and therefore, over the long term, exacerbating civilian harm? That's a much broader question. I don't know that I know the answer. But even setting all of that aside, the reality is that on these strike-by-strike bases, we are seeing civilian harm. We are seeing unlawful attacks. We are seeing liability by whichever coalition entity was directly responsible, as well as the coalition as a whole, which includes the United States. And that alone should be a reason to alter the course.
The next question I'm going to direct, again, I'm going to direct it at you, Andrew, but anyone else is welcome to chime in. Obviously, the U.S. alliance with Saudi Arabia is nothing new, but one thing that does seem to have changed, according to a lot of commentators, is the support specifically for a crown prince against his political rivals. Michael Wolff wrote that Kushner and Trump referred to MBS as our guy, eloquently, and Bob Woodward wrote that he was, afforded diplomatic protocol of a foreign head of state, and that Kushner was promoting MBS against Mohammed bin Nayef for potential rivals, and lots of commentators have pointed to a particular closeness to this crown prince and his agenda. It's made it onto Twitter. Trump tweeted support for the Ritz-Carlton and the Qatar blockade. So I was wondering if I could ask you to comment on that particular closeness and the long-term implications of what it means for the U.S.-Saudi relationship.
Sure, Alex, I think you're right. That is an unprecedented development in the 70-year-old U.S.-Saudi relationship. The U.S. has largely stayed out of internal royal family politics and dealt with whomever was put forward as the representative or as the representatives of the Saudi government. But in this case, it's clear, and we've seen documented elsewhere, that the Trump administration put their thumb on the scale in favor of Mohammed bin Salman. And the Obama administration, which I served, faced a similar conundrum where it was clear that there was tension between Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Nayef. And there were internal debates about what to do. Ultimately, a decision was made that we shouldn't pick sides. We shouldn't pick a winner, partly because we're not good at picking winners. We're not going to understand internal politics within the royal family as well as they do. And we can't be certain that the people who are presenting themselves as the saving grace of the United States will in fact behave that way. And I think that's a broader lesson of U.S. foreign policy when we try to pick, whether in Iraq or many other cases, we try to pick an individual to align with, not just a party, not just a broader government. The results tend to be less than satisfactory. And that's clearly been the case here. The closeness that exists between Jared Kushner and MBS in particular, there have been reports, and I think, Alex, you've written about this as well, of secure text messages that they exchange with each other. I've been told recently that those conversations continue, that that there are also secure phone calls between Jared Kushner and MBS. That is deeply problematic. It's not only problematic because we are tying our fate to a single individual as opposed to a broader government. It's also problematic in that when things become that personalized, it becomes less transparent. How can we evaluate what's taking place? What pledges, what agreements are being made if they're being handled in that channel? And I know I served a few months in the Trump administration that there was tremendous concern about what Jared was saying to MBS, what Trump was saying to MBS, and that information wasn't being pushed out to the broader interagency. DOD wasn't aware, state wasn't aware. It wasn't even clear that the national security staff was aware of some of the agreements that were being made. So from a policy-making perspective, that type of close handling of information never leads to a logical policy process. So I think at multiple levels, the continuation of this unique personalized relationship is not what the United States wants. We would be wise to return to a government-to-government relationship and try to diversify our connections with other major players within Saudi Arabia, both within the government and outside of it.
So at this time, I'm going to go to audience questions. And because we're running a bit short on time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take two at once, and then you all can respond however you'd like. And just keep in mind that if your question is a speech and not a question, I will cut you off. All right, so anyone? Great, so we got a mic coming your way.
Is this on? Dusty Hanson again. I just was wondering, is maybe like some of the policies that we've seen out of MBS, are these maybe like preconditioning the people for worse times ahead? Like as they see maybe the oil is not going to be the reliable provider in the future, you know, that could cause a lot of unrest in the future. So, I mean, is this kind of a way of just like nipping the bud before it becomes an issue in their society?
Great. Anyone else? Yes.
I'm going to ask the question that came to me because I'd love the thoughts of this panel on MBS's hold on power. Do we feel that he's secure, or has he got internal challengers?
Anyone start off. Dustin, to your question, I think that MBS is working against two potential timelines. One is his father's longevity and wanting to ensure that he is the person who will succeed King Salman when he passes away, but also a recognition that times aren't going to get any easier for Saudi Arabia. And what both of those conditions mean is that he is particularly eager in expeditiously consolidating power. He hasn't waited. He hasn't been particularly nuanced or subtle in his approaches to eliminating adversaries. And I think partly that is being driven by the external environment. I mean, I don't know him personally. It's also certainly a possibility, given his other actions, that it's personality-based as well, that this is just the type of person he is. He's a hard charger and wants to go out and seize what he believes to be his. But I certainly think the external environment and the fact that Saudi Arabia, for them, there isn't a deus ex machina on the horizon that's going to rescue them from their plight. It's better to get control now so that when the tougher times do come, there will be greater ability on his part to control what happens subsequently. In terms of his longevity, I mean, it's really, really hard to say. Partly because, Alex, you mentioned at the outset that Saudiology is almost as bad as Kremlin. Mm-hmm. It really is. It's tough to figure out. It's tough to understand what's happening within the royal family. But he is a single person, and he does have individuals who have declared allegiance to him, some who are closer to him, including his brother, the sitting Saudi ambassador in Washington. But the family is an institution, and the family has survived in one way or another now for over 100 years. And I think that survival instinct will kick in if they see things reach a point of crisis. For as bad as things have been in terms of Saudi Arabia's impact on the broader environment, and as offensive and as problematic as some of the internal actions have been, it hasn't reached a fever pitch. And it's only in that moment of crisis will we be able to better tell where people have lined up. But for even, I think for Saudis who may harbor some misgivings, Saudi royal family members who harbor misgivings, now is not the time to show their head, I wouldn't think. Just thinking logically, I have no unique or privileged knowledge about that. So we'll find out when there will be a crisis, and almost certainly there will be, whether he has succeeded in eliminating all of his competitors, in consolidating power, or whether that's going to create the space whereby some type of countervailing force or countervailing group will come up to try to seize power once again.
I would say to that point, it's very, very difficult to evaluate the information that comes out of the country on that point. And I mean, we all know the rumors about spending nights on the yacht. I think the one thing that it is fairly safe to say is that much in the same way that his actions and his policies in Yemen have strengthened Iran's foothold in the country, that his attempts to consolidate power within the royal family have bolstered opposition to his rule. No. More questions? No one. Oh, yeah, sure. Absolutely, yeah.
Hi, thank you, everyone. I was wondering if any of you would like to comment on the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. You know, we're talking about the new face of Saudi Arabia, but if we look at the way the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia responded to the uprising in Bahrain in 2011, you know, sending in troops across the border, etc. I mean, a lot of those things, you know, that we see now is sort of startling. I think if from the perspective of Bahrain, this was happening, you know, already back in 2011, if not much earlier. So what, you know, really is new, in fact, about this, you know, the current situation, and if you'd like to comment at all about the situation in Bahrain and the relationship there.
Sure.
Did you want to take the other question?
Yeah, sure. Let's take the second question.
Is there any analysis that, you know, the Saudi have been unable to really take over Yemen, despite it being a ragtag rebel group? Isn't there some sort of doubt on this analysis that, you know, they're going to be the proxy force to battle, let's be honest, all of these great fires going on in the Middle East? I mean, is there really that faith in Saudi capability, which frankly, from most of the analysts that I know strategically think that they're awful at most of the logistical planning on military operations?
Let's do Bahrain first.
Sure. On Bahrain, you're correct that that interventionism is nothing new. I mean, Bahrain has been called the extra province of Saudi Arabia because the Saudis have traditionally seen it as an extension, certainly of the eastern province, because both are Shia majority populations in those areas, and the Saudis have essentially bankrolled the Bahraini regime, which is Sunni, and has led a crackdown against protesters on Sunni, Shia, it doesn't really matter, anyone who questions the monarchy in Bahrain. And so, you know, I think the way in which it is new is that that same interventionism has been mounted on other countries that wouldn't necessarily have been as subservient in the past as Bahrain has, due to the financial dependency that Bahrain traditionally has had on Saudi Arabia. Because, you know, in the case of Qatar, for example, there was talk that the ultimate goal of the blockade itself was to have regime change in the country to install a Saudi-friendly leader, so it could then become a similar style Bahrain state where it was following Saudi Arabia and the UAE's lead largely. It also obviously was rooted in their support for the Muslim Brotherhood during the Arab Spring and all of these other factors. But I do think, you know, similar to Yemen, is that Saudi Arabia has always seen it as in their interest to be in somewhat control of who is in power to ensure that they also support Saudi Arabian interests. And I think that's why, we've seen Saudi Arabia intervene in Yemen over the years. This is not the first intervention of Saudi Arabia in Yemen. It also intervened in 2009 when former late President Ali Abdullah Saleh was fighting another war against the Houthis. It intervened in the 60s against the Egyptians. And so, I think that this is something certainly that has been repeated over time. I think what's really new to me is kind of the unquestioning U.S. support for these interventions, where there's no, like Andrew said, there's no private conversation saying like this really isn't in your interest, particularly in the current Congress or context where Saudi Arabia is spending an estimated like $5 billion a month on its war in Yemen. There's no U.S. counterpart saying like, is that really in your economic interest when you're trying to do all these economic reforms that kind of invalidate the grand bargain that has always ruled Saudi society, which is why I think we're seeing a larger crackdown and dissent that we've ever seen before, because that kind of bargain that's always been there between the population and the Al Saud family is really wavering.
On the question about U.S. assessment of Saudi capabilities, my impression is that the effort to make Saudi Arabia a proxy force of the United States, including in the context of this Middle East Strategic Alliance, MESA, as it's been called, that the administration has been pursuing, is being driven more by the politicals than by the defense professionals and by the soldiers. I think this is something that appeals to President Trump, it appeals to Jared Kushner, and it appeals to John Bolton. And I think John Bolton actually did serve in the military and the reserves. But these are three individuals who never saw combat, who aren't military experts in and of themselves. Obviously, President Trump and Jared never put on a uniform. And I don't think they have a very fine-tuned sense of what the Saudis are capable of doing. I do think that the Department of Defense, the U.S. military, understands the limitations of the Saudis. The reason they're going along with this, though, is that the U.S. military tends to have an engineering approach, and that is, if there's a problem, we'll fix it. And the way to fix it is through engagement. And this is part of the problem, Andre, you were talking about this earlier in terms of Yemen and whether U.S. support is actually improving this situation. It's viewed in a very narrow and a very scoped way that, well, we have a Saudi military force with these capabilities. We ultimately want to see them get there. We're not going to do it overnight. The best thing we can do is make them slightly better tomorrow. And then the next day we'll make them slightly better after that. And it really becomes more of a policy of faith than of fact. And I don't see a lot of rigorous analysis of whether the improvement is what they would expect it to be or is sufficiently great that it would justify the cost associated with pursuing those efforts. But unfortunately, it doesn't appear that those who have reservations about what the Saudis can do as a military force within the region are stepping up and seeking to apply any brakes to the administration's headlong rush with them.
All right, I'm getting the red light on this, so could we get a round of applause for the panelists, though? Yes. All right. Sure thing, yeah.
Always happens in this room.
We're going to have just a few closing comments now while everyone leaves the stage. Thanks so much to our last panel, and in fact to all of the outstanding speakers today. My name is Rod Dixon. Coming from London, it's been wonderful to have a day where there's been no discussion at all about Brexit, which could be another whole event in and of itself. As all of the truly excellent speakers today have highlighted, the timing of this conference has been so unfortunately very telling. With the events in Istanbul, which have very rightly hit the headlines, it has placed the human rights crisis in Saudi Arabia in true focus again, and also, I think, successfully showed the wider pattern that this forms part of, which is so important to keep emphasizing. I was asked a number of months ago, when the tensions in Saudi Arabia were not as much in the headlines as they are at the moment, to, with some other lawyers, gather as much information as we could about the detentions of those persons who were arrested or disappeared in September of last year. This was just before the famous Ritz-Carlton detentions, which certainly hit the headlines again, and which in some ways overshadowed the gravity of the acts, certainly on the evidence that we discovered, of what had happened before, where over 50 persons had either just disappeared or been arrested, and who up until today are still languishing in detention without charge, and in the case of many without even knowing where they are. In some cases there has been family contact, but in many that's not the case. So we set about, as lawyers do, gathering the evidence of what we could establish had in fact happened from family members, from friends. As you'll see from our report, we were not able to name any of those who we were involved in making inquiries with due to their safety concerns, although, as we've said, all of that information is recorded, it's available if there was to be a full investigation by the UN or any other body into the situation. And we discovered quite startlingly how difficult it was to get concrete information about what had in fact happened. And piecing the whole narrative together was very challenging, much more challenging than it usually is in any human rights situation, which, as a lawyer, I've been involved in many around the world. But we were able to put together, as far as we could ascertain, the situation as it occurred in September and thereafter, and we've been able to update it as well from time to time. The point being, as lawyers, to gather the available evidence and make it available for action to be taken. Legal action, yes, but also other, wider political, diplomatic action that we've heard about a lot today. But certainly from our point of view as the lawyers, and this is what I wanted to highlight in our short time in the closing remarks, the importance of, firstly, being able to go back to source forensically what is the available material and information, and make that available. Very often we talk, and it's absolutely essential to have the wider, broader analysis, but you've got to come back to, well, what's actually going on the ground? How do you establish that and prove that? So important, especially in a world today where we seem to be sort of post-forensic analysis, where you can say you came to Salisbury to look at the clock tower and expect that to be taken into account as a truthful analysis. So we seem to have lost that, and part of what we were doing was to establish that this is what we do. It's apolitical. It can be done for any party. I always say, when people say, why do you lawyers look at a country like this? Well, I look at many countries, that's what we do. I've looked at human rights violations committed by the UK government as well, and always say to other governments like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, this is not a witch hunt. You're not being targeted. The point is that many governments commit these violations, and it's about the evidence, understanding what has happened, and then the second point that I wish to emphasize, upholding the rule of law. As states, you adopted these rules. As governments, you adopted them, not only Saudi Arabia, but governments around the world, and agreed amongst each other for your own benefit and security and those of your citizens, to ensure that these rules, these human rights norms and principles are applied equally across the board, irrespective of what your political considerations are. And yes, there might often be arguments about whether or not you have proved the offense to a certain level beyond reasonable doubt if you're in a criminal setting. But as we are familiar with within our courts, and we all rely on this every day, it is so important that we're able to turn to the facts and have those examined and scrutinized, and then for there to be an outcome, to know what the truth is. I mean, the truth is not something that is unfathomable, that you can't reach. You certainly can attain it, and then the law should apply based on those facts, irrespective of what the outcome is. The moment we start carving out exceptions and saying, well, you've got to be careful here or sensitive there, don't touch these countries, we create the very dangerous precedent of that applying in the same way to us. It means that, yes, if there's an exception there, one day when you're affected, people could say, well, why doesn't that exception apply in exactly the same way? Your loved ones might be directly affected, and you can't then rely on the rule of law anymore. So doing that work highlighted both the forensic process and the importance of that throughout this, and of course it's been vital to have the overall political, diplomatic and policy analysis of what happened. But we shouldn't underestimate the importance of establishing the facts and then ensuring that there can be proper legal remedies devised to seek redress, to deter future actions, and at the very least have a record established. If there can't be legal remedies right away, for that to be done in the future. Sometimes you do have to wait a long time for justice and change, but it will come, but it won't arise without a proper record at the time and retaining the evidence, as has happened in Yemen. We've heard from many speakers on that today, with the establishment of a UN body of experts who are gathering that evidence so that there could be potential prosecutions in the future. The same has happened in Syria, and even if there are political difficulties with the establishment of courts through the Security Council or through the UN, there will be a record that can be used, and I would urge the UN and all states to look at creative mechanisms for establishing bodies that can prosecute these crimes. If they can't go to the ICC or there are problems with that jurisdiction, then to look elsewhere, as was done with the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, with ad hoc courts. We, as the lawyers involved on behalf of a number of the victims, their families and friends and loved ones, are going to continue to seek legal remedies wherever we can. We wanted to continue to raise those issues through a human rights conference and an event like this, and hope to do more of those in the future, but then also look for very practical remedies. States have created many avenues, and through those procedures and laws, there are steps that can be taken. Some of them are quite primitive in how far they've developed so far, but it's only through bringing cases, as lawyers we know and those who follow the law, that you can develop it and change it for the good over time. And where you think, this is impossible, there's nowhere to go, that's precisely the time where you need to think, no, one has to try and try and try again and keep attempting to ensure that the law can be applied as it was meant to be. Just to highlight very briefly 3 areas that we are focusing on. First of all, there's the UPR of Saudi Arabia coming up in Geneva. That's Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Record on the 5th of November, and states and bodies are being urged to ask direct questions about these matters, and also to look for guarantees about effective change in these areas. Sometimes this process can be smashing your head against the door, very slow, but I think very important for the international community to look to unite and put pressure on. Secondly, one step that can be taken, if they do wish to, is that countries like Saudi Arabia, and once again, it doesn't only have to be them, all countries that cannot uphold human rights norms should not be playing a critical role in the UN Human Rights Council. There's a mechanism for removing them from that body. And just recently, last week, the European Parliament passed a resolution on Yemen in which it recommended that the Human Rights Council consider whether or not countries like Saudi Arabia should remain in the Human Rights Council and overseeing and monitoring human rights around the world, given their own track record. So a very tangible step that could be taken. And then lastly, I would also emphasize universal jurisdiction, because many of these crimes are ones where immunity no longer attaches, as Mr. Pinochet found when he came to the United Kingdom, as others have found when they've traveled around the world. These are norms that apply equally to all officials and authorities, and if they don't uphold the laws that they've signed up to, or which are part of customary law, which we all uphold, that was mentioned earlier, then there could be civil action taken against them, or they could be arrested. And in that way, there could be direct justice for the victims. So various avenues of universal jurisdiction are also being pursued. I think it was a rather broody and brutish Hobbes who said that it is not wisdom that makes law, but authority. And I agree to some extent, yes. The authority of states is vital in underpinning all of this. It is still a world in which international law depends entirely on states. But I would also emphasize, to add to the quote, that the law as it is developed, that body of international human rights law, of international law more generally, has its own value and authority because of its integrity and the fact that it has been well tested and attuned after time, and is ultimately supported worldwide by common human values and humanity generally, as a way of protecting our lives and ensuring that our rights are upheld. So that inherent legitimacy in the law itself, in addition to the authority that states give it, is something which we can all rely upon to pursue those who continue to breach flagrantly. And I hope that what we've been able to do today is to keep the candle burning for that very important underlying value, to ensure that international human rights law will be upheld, no matter how difficult the path ahead. It is a body that is undoubtedly widely supported. It has been implemented in many vital situations, and it can be right here. The challenge is for us to do it now and to continue doing that. Thank you very much to all of our speakers again for their enlightening and passionate inputs. And then thank you, I'm going to hand over now to Stephen Schneerbaum for hosting us today. He's going to do some final comments and end with a big bang, I believe. But yeah, we're enormously grateful for that and for your opening comments and for bringing it all to a crescendo now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rod. I'm not sure about the bang part. That was not in the script, and I don't promise such a thing. But what I would like to do, aside from thanking the panelists and also thanking all of you who attended, is just to see whether, very briefly, whether we've answered the questions that we set out by asking this morning. We said this morning that the panels would discuss two questions, and lawyers like to pose questions so that they can then be answered. First question, can there be reform without rights in Saudi Arabia? I think the answer that we heard from the panel this morning was unanimously that there cannot be. Now, what does that mean? There cannot be reform without rights in Saudi Arabia. Let me suggest this, that you heard from each of the panelists this morning the same theme, which talked about the concept in Saudi Arabia maintained by MBS, not changed by MBS, according to which rights are conferred by the government and received graciously by the people. That's not what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says. That's not what the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights says. That's not what any of the instruments making up the International Bill of Rights says. And interestingly, of course, it's often said that the Universal Declaration, adopted in December 1948, was adopted by the General Assembly unanimously. That's not true. It wasn't unanimous. It was without dissent, but it was not unanimous. One of the countries that abstained from that vote was Saudi Arabia. And that was not by accident. Saudi Arabia had important reasons not to endorse the Universal Declaration, but today we all espouse that declaration as declaratory of customary international law. And until that changes, until that concept of what rights are changes, then I would submit that the panelists are absolutely right. There cannot be reform without rights in Saudi Arabia. Now, I think we didn't give quite such a clear answer to the second question. The second question was US responses to Saudi foreign policy, and of course the speakers didn't focus exclusively on US responses by any means, but the question after the semicolon is, whose interests are being served? Well, I don't know about you, I haven't got the slightest idea whose interests are being served, other than the interests of Mohammed bin Salman. I think what we heard was that there are atrocities being committed in Yemen. I think what we heard is that the lesson that some of us Americans thought that we had taken away from the decade of the invasion of Iraq, which is that we are going to scrutinize acts being taken in our name, potential atrocities and human rights violations in our name. We're going to say no to that. We haven't learned that lesson, or at least we haven't internalized it. And as far as who else's interests might be served, it's hard to say. The speakers were unanimous that the idea of combating terrorism, combating al-Qaeda, combating ISIS, is not only not being accomplished by what's happening in Yemen, but it's being encouraged. And so the fact that that question remains, after this discussion, a difficult and vexed one, tells us, I think, what we want to know. It tells us that the answer to this has to be more radical than simply sort of incrementally assigning responsibility, but rather thinking this is something that is wrong. And when something is wrong, we should be doing something about it. When something is wrong, one of my personal heroes is Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former president of Liberia, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011. And in her lecture at the Peace Prize ceremony in Oslo, her theme, speaking, as she said, not for the women of the world, because she had no mandate to do that, but to the women of the world. She was one of 3 women granted the prize on that day in Oslo. Her message was, find your voices and raise your voices. And I think that, if anything, is the takeaway that we have from that second panel. We need to find our voices and raise them, because bad things, atrocities, human rights violations, violations of the law of war are being committed, at least indirectly, in our names. So that's what I take away from this, and let me conclude as I began by reading a quote, actually 2 quotes. The first is from Charles Lane, who wrote in yesterday's Washington Post, "To those listening closely to what MBS actually says, it is clear that his top priority is not and never has been the expansion of individual freedom. His aim is to modernize the Saudi monarchy so as to render it sustainable under a new economic and geopolitical conditions of the 21st century, with the 33-year-old MBS on top for a long, long time." Lane's column concluded with this quote, "It was painful for me several years ago when several friends were arrested. I said nothing. I didn't want to lose my job or my freedom. I'm worried about my family. I have made a different choice now. I have left my home, my family, and my job, and I am raising my voice." And as you might have gathered, the speaker, the writer, was Jamal Khashoggi. So I leave you with that. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to Nikita Bernardo for her work in organizing and arranging for all of this, and to Rod Dixon. And thanks to everyone for coming.